The war was never supposed to last this long. In the beginning, it had a name, a reason, and a deadline whispered confidently by leaders who stood behind polished podiums and promised resolution within months. But months became years, and years turned into something darker, something that no longer felt like conflict, but like a machine that fed on time itself. Daniel Hayes had covered wars before, but this one felt different. It didn't move like chaos. It moved like design. Every morning he woke to the same pattern. Explosions reported at dawn, negotiations announced by noon, and silence by nightfall. Not peace, just silence. As if someone somewhere was pressing pause on violence only long enough to reset it again. It was during one of these quiet nights, staring at flickering footage in his dim hotel room, that Daniel noticed something no one else had mentioned. The front lines weren't shifting. The destruction looked fresh, but the map never changed. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Wars could stall, but patterns don't lie, and Daniel had built his career on patterns. He started collecting data, dates, strikes, casualty reports, supply routes, and then he found the first crack in the story the world had been told. Supply shipments were increasing, not decreasing, not just from allies, but from neutral territories, countries that had publicly declared distance from the conflict. One name kept appearing, buried deep in trade logs and redacted documents, a nation that officially had no involvement. Yet its exports had doubled since the war began. Weapons parts, fuel components, reconstruction materials, everything needed to both destroy and rebuild. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a chill creeping into his spine. This wasn't just a war, it was a cycle. The realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded like a slow-burning fuse. Every destroyed bridge was rebuilt within weeks. Every bombed city was reconstructed just enough to function again, only to be targeted later. Contracts were signed faster than peace agreements. Insurance claims processed quicker than ceasefires. Daniel followed the money next, because money never lies. And when he finally saw the numbers, his breath caught in his throat. $15 million. That was the daily profit increase tied directly to war activity, not globally, but for one specific country. A country that never sent soldiers, never took sides, never appeared in headlines. Yet every explosion echoed in its economy like a cash register ringing. Daniel stared at the screen, his fingers trembling slightly. One country, he whispered to himself, does not want this war to end. Daniel knew that numbers alone weren't enough. He needed proof, something undeniable, something that could survive denial, political pressure, and the inevitable attempts to bury it. He began reaching out to contacts, old sources who owed him favors or still trusted his instincts. Most didn't respond. A few warned him to stop digging. One message stood out, sent from an encrypted account. "You're looking in the right place, but you don't understand how deep it goes." Attached was a single file, coordinates. 2 days later, Daniel found himself standing outside a massive industrial complex in a country that publicly claimed neutrality. It looked ordinary from a distance, but the closer he got, the more the illusion fell apart. Security was tighter than any civilian facility had a right to be. Trucks moved in and out constantly, their cargo sealed, their destinations classified. And every truck carried a symbol, one that matched the export logs he had been studying. Inside, the truth was even worse than he imagined. Through a combination of bribery, bluffing, and sheer luck, Daniel managed to get access to internal documents. What he found wasn't just evidence of profit, it was a blueprint. The war wasn't being prolonged by accident. It was being sustained by design. Contracts were structured to ensure dependency. One side received defensive equipment, the other received offensive upgrades. Both believed they were gaining an advantage. In reality, they were being balanced, kept equal enough to continue fighting but never strong enough to win. And every time destruction reached a certain threshold, reconstruction deals were triggered automatically. It was a perfect system. War created damage, damage created demand, demand created profit, and profit ensured the war continued. Daniel felt a growing weight in his chest as he pieced it together. This wasn't just exploitation, it was orchestration. Lives weren't being lost as a consequence of war, they were being factored into it. Every casualty was a statistic in a financial model. Every destroyed home was an opportunity waiting to be built. He scrolled through projections, his stomach turning as he read forecasts extending years into the future. The war wasn't expected to end, it was expected to grow. And at the center of it all was that one country, quietly pulling strings, quietly collecting billions while the world argued over blame. Daniel closed his laptop slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened screen. "If this gets out," he murmured, "it won't just end the war, it'll expose everything." Getting the truth was one thing, surviving it was another. The moment Daniel began transmitting fragments of his findings to his editor, things started to change. His calls dropped, his emails bounced. Faces he passed on the street lingered a little too long. And then came the warning, not subtle, not hidden, but direct. A note slipped under his door. Some wars are not meant to end. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He packed his equipment, backed up his data, and prepared for the possibility that he might not make it out. But fear wasn't new to him. What was new was the scale of what he had uncovered. This wasn't corruption. It was an entire system built on controlled chaos. And if he walked away now, it would continue, unchecked, unstoppable, invisible. He made his move at dawn. Using a secure satellite connection, Daniel began uploading everything: documents, financial records, internal communications. He didn't send it to just one outlet. He sent it everywhere. Independent journalists, global networks, anonymous leak platforms. If they silenced him, the truth would still spread. As the upload bar crawled forward, he watched the sun rise over a city that had been rebuilt 3 times in 5 years. A city that had become a symbol of resilience and, unknowingly, a cog in a machine designed to profit from its suffering. When the upload finally completed, Daniel exhaled slowly. It was done. The truth was no longer his to protect. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Markets reacted first, then governments, then the public. The country at the center of it all denied everything, of course, but denial couldn't erase evidence. Protests erupted, alliances fractured. And for the first time since the war began, real negotiations started to take place. Not the scripted kind, real ones. The kind that come from pressure, from exposure, from the collapse of carefully constructed lies. But even as the possibility of peace emerged, Daniel couldn't shake a final, unsettling thought. Systems like this don't disappear overnight. They adapt, they evolve. And somewhere behind closed doors, someone was already calculating the next opportunity. Because as long as war could be turned into profit, there would always be those who refused to let it end. The world didn't absorb the truth all at once. It fractured under it. At first, the reaction looked like outrage. Headlines exploded, anchors spoke with urgency, and governments rushed to issue statements filled with carefully chosen words. But Daniel noticed something unsettling beneath the noise. The outrage was loud, but short. Within days, the narrative began to shift. Questions turned into debates. Debates turned into doubt. And doubt, as always, became the perfect shield. Unverified sources, possible manipulation, geopolitical misinformation. The phrases repeated across networks like a script being read from the same invisible page. Daniel watched it unfold from a safe house, his jaw tightening. The truth hadn't been denied, it had been diluted. But on the ground, things were different. People weren't debating, they were reacting. In cities that had been bombed, rebuilt, and bombed again, protests erupted with a fury that couldn't be contained by headlines. Survivors held up images of their homes, before and after destruction, demanding answers no one wanted to give. Soldiers began asking questions too, not publicly, not yet, but quietly, among themselves. Why did the supplies never stop? Why did victories never last? Why did it always feel like they were fighting, but never moving forward? The cracks were spreading, not in governments, but in belief, and belief was far more dangerous to lose. Then came the first real fracture. A mid-level official, someone buried deep enough to know the truth but not powerful enough to control it, defected. The video appeared online without warning. No production, no polish. Just a man sitting in a dim room, his face pale, his voice shaking. He didn't just confirm Daniel's findings, he expanded them. "It's not just one country," he said, staring directly into the camera. "It's a network." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs as he watched. The man described coordinated agreements, shared profits, silent partnerships between nations that publicly opposed each other, enemies on the surface, partners underneath. The war wasn't being sustained by one player, it was being protected by many. Once the idea of a network took hold, everything changed. The war was no longer a single story, it became a web of connections stretching across continents. Daniel returned to his data, this time looking beyond the obvious, and what he found was worse than anything he had uncovered before. Financial flows didn't just point to one country, they looped through multiple economies, disguised as investments, aid packages, infrastructure projects. Money moved in circles so complex that no single path revealed the truth. But when viewed together, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't chaos, it was architecture. The deeper he dug, the clearer the structure became. Private contractors, international banks, logistics firms, even humanitarian organizations, some knowingly, others unknowingly, were part of the same system. Each played a role, each benefited in some way. And because responsibility was spread so thin, no one could be held accountable. That was the genius of it. There was no single villain to expose, no single target to bring down. The system was designed to survive exposure. Even now, as protests grew and governments scrambled, the machine kept running. Supplies moved, contracts were signed, the war continued. Daniel began to understand the real danger wasn't just the war, it was normalization. People were adapting to it. Markets stabilized again, news cycles moved on, new conflicts emerged, pulling attention away, and slowly, almost invisibly, the outrage faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the system to keep breathing, enough for the profits to keep flowing. 15 million a day became 20, then 25. Daniel stared at the updated figures, a cold realization settling over him. "It doesn't need to hide anymore," he whispered. "It just needs us to look away." By the time Daniel decided to step back into the public eye, he knew the fight had changed. This wasn't about exposing a secret anymore. The secret was already out. This was about making people care long enough to act. He agreed to a live interview, knowing the risks, knowing the pressure that would come. As he sat under the studio lights, facing a camera broadcasting to millions, he realized something unsettling. The battlefield had shifted. It wasn't out there anymore, in distant cities and shattered landscapes. It was here, in perception, in attention, in truth itself. "They don't need to win the war," Daniel said during the broadcast, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. "They just need to keep it going." The room fell silent, because every day it continues, someone gets richer. He didn't name names this time. He didn't point fingers, because it was bigger than that now. It was a system that thrived on distance, distance between people and consequences, between actions and understanding. And as long as that distance existed, the system would survive. After the interview, as Daniel stepped outside into the noise of a city untouched by war, he felt a strange mix of victory and defeat. The truth was out. People knew. And yet, the world kept moving. Cars passed, screens lit up, life continued as if nothing had changed. He looked up at the skyline, his expression unreadable, because deep down he understood something most people didn't want to face. Ending a war wasn't just about stopping bullets. It was about dismantling the reasons they kept being fired, and those reasons were far more powerful than anyone had imagined. For a brief moment, it looked like the war might finally end. Ceasefire talks gained momentum, leaders stood together for photographs, and the word peace began to reappear in headlines that had long forgotten it. Markets reacted instantly, stocks tied to conflict dipped, reconstruction bids slowed, and for the first time in years, the machinery of war seemed to hesitate. Daniel watched it unfold with cautious disbelief. Had it actually worked? Had exposure, pressure, and public outrage finally forced the system to break? For a few days, it felt possible, but then something strange happened. The violence didn't stop, it shifted. Smaller conflicts ignited in regions that had been stable for years. Old tensions resurfaced, new alliances fractured, and within weeks, the global focus began to scatter. The original war, the one everyone had fought so hard to expose, slowly slipped out of the spotlight, not because it had ended, but because something else had taken its place. Daniel felt a familiar unease creep back in as he tracked the developments. The pattern was too clean, too efficient. It wasn't chaos, it was replacement. He returned to the numbers. The profits hadn't dropped. They had moved. Once Daniel saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The system had never depended on one war. It depended on the existence of war itself. When one conflict became too visible, too controversial, too risky, it was quietly deprioritized. Resources shifted, attention redirected, and somewhere else, under a different name, a new conflict began to grow. Not identical, but familiar enough to follow the same structure. Controlled escalation, balanced opposition, endless supply, predictable destruction. He began mapping timelines across multiple regions, layering events over financial data, political movements, and supply chains. The result was horrifying in its clarity. Wars weren't isolated events. They were part of a rotating cycle, a global pattern designed to ensure that instability never truly disappeared, only relocated. The system didn't fail when exposed, it adapted. And the most terrifying part? No one needed to control everything. Each player only had to act in their own interest, profit, power, influence. The system sustained itself because it aligned with human nature. Greed didn't need coordination, it needed opportunity, and war provided the perfect one. Daniel leaned back, staring at the web of connections on his screen. It stretched farther than he had ever imagined. Governments, corporations, private entities, shadow agreements, public enemies, hidden partners, all moving independently, yet creating the same outcome: endless war, endless profit. By the time Daniel published his final report, he knew it wouldn't have the same impact as the first. Not because it was weaker, but because it was bigger. Too big. The kind of truth that people don't reject because it's false, but because it's overwhelming. Still, he released it anyway. Not with urgency this time, but with quiet certainty. The data, the patterns, the undeniable conclusion. There was never just one country, there was never just one war. And there would never be a true ending, only transitions. The response was exactly what he expected. Some believed it, some dismissed it, most moved on. Because accepting it meant accepting something deeply uncomfortable, that the world wasn't broken by accident. It was functioning exactly as designed. Days later, Daniel found himself far from the noise, sitting alone, watching a news report play on a small screen. A new conflict had officially been declared. Different region, different names, same language, same promises of quick resolution, same confidence. He didn't react, he just listened, because he already knew how it would unfold. The opening strikes, the surge of support, the illusion of progress, the slow stall, the endless continuation, and somewhere, behind it all, the quiet sound of profit increasing, one day at a time, 15 million, then more, always more. Daniel turned off the screen, the silence settling in around him. Not peaceful silence, but the kind he had come to recognize from the very beginning, the kind that doesn't mean the war is over, only that it's waiting to begin again.